My name is Helen, and I grew up in a small house where there was always a smell of fresh bread, warm, barely risen from the oven, still moist and smelling of the sweetness of yeast. Our house was modest, but cozy, and as if by an unspoken law, every day began early in the morning with kneading dough. My father, a strong and silent man, took over the family bakery from his parents as an important legacy passed down from generation to generation. I loved helping him with the kneading, feeling the dough gently give way under my fingers, as if its elastic surface was coming to life and waiting for it to become something more than just flour and water. My mother was completely different. It was as if she belonged to another world, far from the aromas of baked bread and the narrow streets of our small town. A realtor, always elegant, in formal suits and high heels, she seemed like a part of a bustling metropolis full of lights and promises. I often saw her driving slowly out of the house in her car, looking out of the window in the hope that one day I would see her happy and contented. But, as I began to understand later, there was always a shadow in her eyes, as if she was looking for something more that my father and I, even together, could not give her. One of those nights when I was 12, I heard her voice. "Helen, set the table," Mom said quickly, impatiently, as if she was being pushed by an invisible clock every day. I hurried away, leaving the book, not quite deftly put it aside, and when I sat down at the table, I heard a conversation that gradually grew louder. My father muttered something, barely audible, as he always did if he didn't want to get into an argument. But I caught the tone of her voice, cold and annoyed. "Another slow month, Tyler. When are you going to pack?" He sighed, and it hurt me to see his shoulders hunch. "Please, Joyce, not in front of Helen," he said, trying to keep the rest of his calm. But Mom just waved him off, her gaze darted to him with annoyance. "Oh, who cares?" She chuckled, making a casual gesture with her hand. "Helen needs to know what a failure her father is." I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. Clutching the edge of the table, I strained with all my might, trying not to cry. Such scenes happened often in our house. Mom, as if experiencing some kind of long-standing contempt, humiliated her father over and over again, and he always tried to smooth over the situation, as if he himself was ashamed of her words. I couldn't say exactly what made her say that. Maybe it wasn't just about the money. Sometimes it seemed to me that Mom felt trapped in a life she didn't choose, like a bird trapped in a cage that had become too cramped for her. Suddenly, her voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "Helen, where's my wine?" I rushed to pour her a glass, but my hands were shaking, and some wine spilled on the snow-white tablecloth. Mom immediately pursed her lips, her eyes narrowed like a predator ready to attack. "You useless girl," her words pierced me like an icy needle. "Can't you do anything right?" Dad intervened, quietly, gently, but with the same affection with which he always treated me. "It's just a little wine, Joyce. It's not a big deal." His gaze was full of a plea, almost a plea for a truce. But Mom just gave him a scornful look. "You're too soft on her," she snorted. "No wonder she grows up to be as pathetic as you." I couldn't help myself and rushed to my room, barely reaching the bed, pressing my face against the pillow, trying not to make a sound. I loved my father so much, sincerely, truly, with all my heart, but I could not understand why he tolerated such words, why he never fought back. I stared at the note, feeling an icy knot tighten in my chest, as if I was being hidden in some dark, cold place where there was no light or exit. Mom's gone. She just left us, leaving behind only a few lines written in her neat, even handwriting, which exuded coldness and indifference. The words cut like a razor. "You're a loser, Tyler, and you, Helen, are a useless burden. Don't look for me." They burned as if they were written with a red-hot iron, leaving scars that I will probably wear for the rest of my life. The following months passed in a vague maelstrom of lawsuits and a constant feeling that my world was falling apart. Dad filed for divorce, and sometimes there was something in his eyes that I had never seen before: fatigue, bitterness, disappointment. He asked the court to deprive my mother of parental rights, and even though I was only 12, I felt that all this left invisible marks on our lives. I remember the cold courtroom, the dim lighting, the smell of old leather seats, and the rough floor where my feet could not find peace. I held his hand, feeling it sweat with tension and fear. We were waiting for Mom, but she never showed up, and it hurt me to realize that even for the completion of this difficult process, she did not find the time. I dozed off, sitting in this room while the adults were talking, as if I was just a spectator eavesdropping on other people's conversations, and caught snatches of phrases like abandonment, unfit parent. When it was finally over, Dad squeezed my hand and, barely audible, but with some kind of unshakable confidence, whispered, "It's all set, Helen. The divorce is final. And now it's just you and me." There was something in his words that both gave me comfort and endless sadness. I nodded, unable to find words, only feeling as if something important had snapped inside, forever changing what I considered my childhood. Since then, life has become more difficult. Dad plunged into his work as if it was the only thing that could keep him afloat. The bakery seemed to have become not just a place of his work, but something that saved us from complete devastation. He spent long hours among the dough and ovens while I took care of the house. Even though I was only 14, I began to feel much older than I really was. My day consisted of school, homework, and cooking dinners. I did the laundry and cleaned, trying to make our house at least a little more comfortable, even if my heart was empty. The years flew by, and when I turned 16, everything changed again. One day Dad came home with such an expression on his face that I immediately realized something important had happened. He looked shocked and sad, and I felt my heart stop. "Uncle Ryan is dead," he said, sinking into a kitchen chair, and his eyes darkened with pain. I came over, hugging him, as if trying to give him my strength. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I whispered, feeling his hand cover mine. He hugged me back, then pulled back a little and, looking into the distance, added, "Helen, you won't believe it. He left me almost $500,000. I'm his only relative." The amount sounded unreal, like something out of a fairy tale. We had never been rich, and for us such money seemed like something beyond the limit. But Dad, recovering a little from the shock, soon found a way to use this inheritance. He invested some of the money in the bakery, upgrading the equipment, expanding the menu, and making our small business more successful than ever. And it was amazing. In a matter of months, the whole city was talking about our bakery. First, Dad hired new people, then he started keeping the place open longer, and before we had time to realize what was happening, he opened a second bakery on the other side of town. By the time I turned 17, we already had 3 successful bakeries. There was no need to worry about money anymore, and our house, which had once been a gloomy refuge, began to glow in a new way. It was the house where our dreams came to life, which we almost lost. It was the first time Dad had ever really smiled. We even allowed ourselves our first vacation, a trip to Europe. It was a miracle for both of us. The moment I heard her voice on the phone, my mind raced with a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. "Helen, this is your mother." These words, like an echo of the past, hit his chest and made his heart ache. She returned to the city, and something in her tone made me stop for a moment, despite all the pain and bitterness that I had been carrying for so many years. She said she wanted to see me. "If you want," she said with some caution, as if she understood that her return might not be at all pleasant for me. I stood there thinking for a long time, and then, almost against my will, I heard my lips saying, Let's meet at Don Jose's Mexican restaurant tomorrow at noon." The next morning I woke up with a feeling of heaviness in my chest. All these years I thought I had dealt with it, with her leaving, with her coldness and contempt, but now that this meeting was coming, the past came flooding back, and I felt like the same little girl that my mother had so easily pushed away. My hands were shaking when I put on my coat, and when I left the house, I felt the cold air go through my bones. I arrived at the cafe early, although it was the very meeting that I would rather avoid. Time dragged on endlessly. I replayed in my head millions of possible conversations, phrases with which I could meet her, but nothing seemed appropriate. Lost in thought, I barely noticed someone enter the cafe. My mother. I recognized her immediately. She looked older, it was inevitable, but she still retained her elegance. Her posture was straight, and her gaze was still as piercing as it had been a long time ago. But there was a girl with her, very young, barely 18, and my heart sank. Her face reflected something familiar that I couldn't help but notice. Mom noticed me and hurried over to me, smiling as if nothing had happened, as if she wasn't the same woman who had left my father and me many years ago. "Helen, dear, you look wonderful," she said with the same confident tone. Then, waving her hand at the girl next to her, she added, "And this is Anna, your sister." Suddenly, everything seemed to disappear into a fog. My sister? Like a blow, this word swept through my mind, awakening in me a strange cocktail of feelings: anger, shock, and, most unexpectedly, a sense of loss that I carried through the years. I looked at Anna, trying to find something in common with me in her features, something native, but at the same time trying to figure out how to accept this fact that my mother had thrown at me so casually. We sat down at the table, and Mom began to tell her story. Her voice sounded calm, even sincere, but I was too wary to give in to it. She talked about Larry, how he left her shortly after Anna was born, how she struggled to survive, raise her youngest daughter, and looked for her place in life, although sometimes she literally had to fight for existence. She explained that she had been hiding her return from me all these years, that shame and the realization of her mistake had kept her at a distance. "I decided to return to my hometown to start over," she said, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes that I had never seen before. I stared at her in disbelief. All those years when she wasn't around, when I was struggling to rebuild my broken childhood, when I was studying, working, building something of my own, she never even thought about coming back. And now, standing in the middle of my living room with her face red with anger, she spoke as if all my achievements, all my work, my apartments were something that should rightfully belong to her. "Half of this property should be mine," she said sharply, her eyes glittering with rage. I saw in front of me the person I had once tried to forgive, but at that moment she seemed to me again the same woman who abandoned my father and me, leaving only a note full of contempt. My chest tightened and the words stuck in my throat, but I straightened up, trying to keep my face and not give in to anger. "Are you serious?" My voice faltered, and I barely hid my disappointment. "You're out of my life. She left me with Dad, without explanation, without support. And now you think you can just come and demand everything I've been working on for so long?" She looked up, her eyes flashing, but I didn't let her get a word in. "All these apartments, this business, my job, I earned it with my hard work," I continued, not holding back my voice. "I learned, went through all the hardships, through every pain and loss to build something worthwhile. You have no right to say that this is your merit or your property." Mom lowered her eyes for a second, but then she looked at me again with stubbornness and bitterness, as if she couldn't accept my words in any way. She crossed her arms over her chest and flashed her eyes. "I gave you life, Helen. That's the most important thing you have. I sacrificed my dreams for you and your father. You have no right to give up on me now when I need it." I took a deep breath, fighting the wave of disappointment and resentment that washed over me. Mom always knew how to turn things around like she was a victim, and she tried to do it again. But I was different. I won't let her manipulate me. You left me when I was 12, I said firmly, meeting her gaze. You could have come back when I needed it most, but you didn't. And now you're coming to demand what you don't deserve. Mom looked at me for a few seconds. Confusion and anger flashed in her eyes, as if she did not expect such words from me. I could see the emotion on her face, either realization or just disappointment that her plan hadn't worked. The silence was broken by the soft creak of the door. Anna was standing in the aisle, watching us with alarm and bewilderment. She clearly didn't understand what was going on, but her gaze darted from me to Mom, and on her face was an expression of fear of losing again that fragile illusion of a family that we had barely begun to create. I felt sorry for her and looked at my mom. Mom, you've already lost enough. Don't destroy what little we have left. If you really need help, I'll help you. But you can't demand it. She froze, not knowing how to respond, and her lips tightened into a thin line. It seemed that my statement finally broke through the protective layer of her pride and made her think. The words seemed to get stuck in my throat, and I barely managed to say, "How can you do this, Mom?" There was silence on the other side of the phone, and I heard her sharp intake of breath, as if my words really hurt her. "How can I?" Her voice trembled, but there was still anger and reproach in it. "How can you not support your own family? You're sitting on this money, in these apartments, and your sister wants to study. You can't even imagine what it's like to take care of someone without money, without help. If it weren't for your callousness, Helen, we wouldn't have to." I couldn't stand interrupting her. "You left me when I was 12. You've given up on me, on Dad, on our whole life. You left us with a note full of contempt, and now you're accusing me of supposedly owing you something?" Her voice faltered, but she found the strength to answer. "You don't understand, Helen. I couldn't live the life your father chose for us anymore. I wanted more, for myself, and maybe for you. But life didn't give me a second chance. Everything I was trying to do, everything I wanted for us, it just slipped away." Her words hung in the air like echoes of a long-forgotten pain, but they couldn't heal the gap that yawned between us. I felt the past burning me again, leaving only a cold residue. "You didn't do anything for me, Mom," I said calmly, trying to hold on despite the storm of emotions. "You didn't see how I studied, worked, built my life from scratch. And now you want me to give it all to you? I cannot. And I won't." She sighed heavily, and her voice took on a steely tone. "Okay, Helen, if you can't, then I'll do what I have to do. You left me no choice." She hung up the phone without saying a word goodbye. I sat there, still holding the phone in my hands, feeling a dull, painful rage rising inside me, mixed with deep sadness. It wasn't the mother I once wanted back. She was a woman who saw in me only a way to benefit. She turned our seemingly sacred bond into a struggle for control and money. I put down my phone and tried to collect my thoughts. In recent weeks, her shadow has hung over my life, destroying everything that was dear to me. The memories that used to be warm have now become a source of pain. Deep down, I knew she wouldn't rest until she got her way, and I have to decide how to protect myself and my life. I stood there in front of her, and I had no more tears, no more words. I looked at this woman, my mother, who was now more of a stranger to me than a native person, and I understood. Her pompous phrases, contemptuous glances, eternally reproachful tone, all this became alien, completely alien. She was still saying something harsh, cutting words, as always, but this time I didn't hear any of them. My own words echoed in my head, Watch me." My words were a direct challenge that she didn't believe, and I could see it in her cold, self-confident gaze. When I turned around and left her apartment, the footsteps echoed loudly in the empty hallway. I felt on edge. A mixture of anger, resentment, disappointment, and despair was building in my chest, like a wave ready to sweep away everything in its path. It seemed to me that tears were about to flow like a river, but I stood there, inhaling and exhaling deeply, refusing to give her a single emotion, not a single drop of my weakness. The way home flew by in a fog. Pictures of the past years were spinning in my head, the faces of people who were nearby, scenes from childhood, moments when I so desperately wanted love and support, but received only indifference and coldness. I thought about how much effort I had put into building my life from scratch, and how my mother, as soon as she returned to my life, instantly tried to destroy it all. It was painful to think that the man who should have been my strongest support had instead become my heaviest burden. When I got home, I knew I had to act, and I needed to resolve this issue once and for all. The next morning, I called Miss Stevens, my lawyer. The words came out with difficulty, and my voice trembled as I told her everything that had happened. Miss Stevens listened attentively, nodding occasionally, and finally said, "Helen, this is a difficult decision, and it will be accompanied by unpleasant moments. But unfortunately, in this situation, you simply have no other choice. If your mother refuses to pay for utilities and violates the lease, you have every right to sue her." Her words were like an icy prick, but I nodded, feeling relief and bitterness fill me at the same time. At that moment, it was as if I had lost the last illusion about my mother. This was not the woman I wanted to remember and love, but the person who turned my life into a field for manipulation. When I returned home with the documents, there was no doubt or fear in my heart anymore. I knew that I was doing everything to protect my life, and this was my only way out. The next step was to hand her an official eviction notice, and I had to do that myself. I did not immediately decide on this step. I sat in the car in front of her house for several minutes, gathering my strength, and then finally climbed the stairs to her door. The inner strength that I had been saving up for so long was now my shield. Mom opened the door with a displeased expression on her face, immediately casting an irritated glance at my documents. "Oh, it's you," she said contemptuously, and her tone left no doubt that she expected nothing from me but concessions. "I hope you finally come to your senses about selling the apartment for Anna's sake. We agreed that you would help the family. It's your responsibility." I could barely contain my anger when I replied, "Mom, it's not my responsibility to pay your bills or your housing. I helped you with the apartment, but you violated all our agreements." With that, I handed her the eviction notice. Her eyes widened, and for a moment her face paled, as if she had been slapped. "You are ungrateful," she screamed, and her voice echoed down the empty hallway. "I've done everything for you, and you. Did you dare to kick your own mother out?" I could see tears glistening in her eyes, but this time I wasn't going to relent. "Do you call everything for me because you abandoned me and lied to everyone around you, spreading vile rumors about me?" I said coldly, feeling the words coming out of me like the long-awaited truth. I couldn't hold back any longer, and my patience finally broke. Mom stepped forward, her eyes blazing with hatred. She grabbed my shirt, shouting insults. "You're nobody. Do you hear? Nobody. Heartless, ungrateful." I flinched, but took a step back, fumbling in my pocket for my phone. "That's enough," I gasped, breathing heavily. "One more word and I'm calling the police." She froze, and confusion flashed across her face. But instead of softening, she continued to hiss. Her anger was like hot lava that poured out uncontrollably. By the time the police arrived, I could barely stand on my feet, and tears were already streaming down my face. I explained the situation, showed the eviction notice to the officers, trying to speak as calmly as possible. One of the officers turned to Mom and calmly said, "Ma'am, this is a civil case. You'd better settle it peacefully or go to court if necessary." Her face twisted. She gave me one last piercing look full of contempt and malice, and only smiled coldly. "You won't do that. You don't have the courage to sue your own mother." I looked at her and realized that this was not my mother, but just a woman who had never been really close to me. "Watch me," I whispered, feeling something irrevocably change inside me. And when I left her that day, I knew there would be no turning back this time. I turned around and left the courtroom, leaving behind the slam of its massive door, which seemed to close not only this case, but also that chapter of my life that had always burdened me. As I walked to the car, a slight chill ran down my spine, but not from cold or fear, but from a sharp, burning feeling of freedom that slowly began to pulse somewhere in the depths of my soul. Thoughts of the past day were spinning in my head. The scenes of the meeting, every word spoken in the courtroom, dragged before my eyes, as if on slow-motion film. I saw again how my mother, tired and pale, tried to soften the judge, feigning sobs and telling me how cruelly and heartlessly I, her own daughter, tried to kick her out into the street. Every word seemed like a farce, almost a performance that she put on just to make me feel guilty again. But when my lawyer got up from his seat, for the first time in a long time I felt the power on my side. He calmly and methodically told the judge the whole truth, taking out every little thing, every line from the past, as if from an old dusty book. The words about her leaving, giving up parental rights, debts, non-payment of alimony, all this sounded like a bolt from the blue. I saw my mother's face turn pale when he presented the documents, proof of her financial security, which she had so carefully hidden. It was a blow she didn't seem to expect to recover from. There was silence in the hall, and at that moment it seemed to me that even the walls held their breath, waiting for the verdict. The judge turned to Mom, and his face was stern, as if carved out of stone. "Mrs. Stevens, this court allows Helen Stevens to evict you. In addition, you are required to reimburse the rent for the last month of your stay in the apartment." The judge's hammer struck the wooden podium, and the sound, hollow and sonorous, echoed throughout the hall. My thoughts returned to Anna, and I saw her scared, lost face full of confusion again. When I left the courtroom, I noticed her standing on the sidelines, with downcast eyes, as if shame and fear had captured her completely. She looked at me as if she was afraid that I would pass by. At that moment, I felt pain for her. She was not to blame for what happened between me and Mom. I walked up to her, trying not to pay attention to Mom's look, which was burning with anger and resentment. "Anna," I said, trying to keep my voice soft. "I'm sorry that things have gone so far. It's not your fault. If you need help, if you really need support or someone to talk to, I'm always there. You can come to me, okay?" Anna looked at me, her eyes wet with tears. She nodded and answered in a strangled voice, "Thank you, Helen. I'm sorry that I didn't know about everything before." I just smiled sadly, patting her shoulder, and turned around, feeling something let go inside. It's been a few weeks since Mom and Anna left my apartment. I heard that they moved to another mom's apartment in another city. We didn't get in touch anymore. No phone calls, no messages, silence became our only connection. Now that it was over, I stood in the empty apartment and stared at the walls that had witnessed everything that had happened in recent months. It seemed that yesterday my fear, my pain, the hope that my relationship with my mother could heal, that we could fix everything, lived within these walls. But the reality turned out to be cruel. My memory brought back scenes, how I opened the door of this apartment, hoping that my mother's return would be a new beginning, how I tried to establish a connection with Anna, trying to see her as a sister, not a rival for attention. Every little thing came back with excruciating clarity. All these months I've been fighting, hoping for the best, and thus becoming vulnerable to her manipulations. But now, standing in silence, I felt an invisible weight slipping off my shoulders, as I let go of all expectations, resentments, and disappointments. I went to the window, looking out at the view, breathing in the fresh air with a subtle taste of freedom. I no longer had to be afraid. I no longer had to adapt to someone's demands, endure ridiculous reproaches and excruciating guilt. This apartment, these walls, my whole life now belonged only to me. I realized that I could move forward, and this feeling was completely new, frightening, but inspiring. That night, I returned home with a clear thought: my past would no longer be able to pull me down. I let him go and finally felt free.